The sky bled crimson as Novak's swollen fingers wrapped around the curved handle of her sickle. The late August heat bearing down on her mercilessly as she tried to harvest the remaining wheat in her field before the promised storms arrived. At 6 months pregnant and alone, every swing sent pain radiating through her lower back. But she persisted she had no choice if she and her unborn child were to survive the coming winter in Awahi, Nevada Territory. 1871. Julia wiped sweat from her brow with her forearm, leaving a streak of dirt across her face. The 24 acres her late husband Thomas had claimed 2 years ago seemed impossibly vast now. 3 months ago, he'd ridden into town for supplies and never returned. 2 days later, the sheriff found his body, shot in the back on a lonely stretch of trail likely ambushed by bandits. Now Julia was left to manage everything alone, with only the growing life inside her for company. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, trying to ignore the cramps forming in her calves. She'd managed to harvest nearly half an acre today, but looking across the golden expanse still waiting to be cut, despair threatened to overwhelm her. At this rate, most of the crop would be lost to the coming storms, and with it, her only means of survival through winter. The sound of hoofbeats pulled her attention away from her work. A rider approached from the neighboring property to the east. Julia straightened as best she could, one hand instinctively moving to her belly while the other gripped her sickle tighter. Living alone, she'd learned to be cautious. The man rode a magnificent chestnut stallion, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the setting sun. As he drew closer, Julia recognized him as Nathan Blackett, who had purchased the adjacent property last spring. They had exchanged polite nods when passing on the road to town, but little else. He was known to be quiet but fair in his dealings, having quickly established one of the most promising cattle operations in the territory. He pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of her field and removed his hat, revealing hair the color of dark honey. "Mrs. Novak," he called out, his deep voice carrying across the field. "Evening to you." Julia nodded cautiously. "Mr. Blackett." He surveyed her field with a practiced eye, taking in the vast amount of uncut wheat. "Noticed you working out here past few days, making progress, but—" He trailed off, perhaps realizing how his observation might sound. "I'm managing," Julia replied stiffly, pride forcing her chin up despite the exhaustion threatening to buckle her knees. Nathan Blackett studied her for a long moment. His eyes, the color of a summer sky, moved from her face to her swollen belly and back again. Something in his expression shifted. "I've got 5 men at my place with nothing pressing until the cattle drive next month," he said, his tone matter of fact. "We could have this field harvested in 3 days, maybe 4. Julia's hand tightened around her sickle. "I can't pay for help, Mr. Blackett." A small smile touched his lips. "Didn't offer it for pay, Mrs. Novak." "I don't accept charity," she said firmly, even as her back screamed in protest at her stubborn stance. He nodded as if he'd expected this response. "Not charity, neighborly assistance." He adjusted his hat. "My mother would have had my hide if she knew I let a woman in your condition work a field alone while I sat idle." Julia hesitated, torn between desperate need and fierce pride. Before she could respond, a sharp pain shot through her abdomen, causing her to gasp and double over. Nathan was off his horse in an instant, crossing the distance between them with long strides. His hand caught her elbow, steadying her. "Mrs. Novak, Julia, you all right?" The pain subsided, leaving Julia breathless. "It's nothing, just been on my feet too long." His expression hardened. "This isn't a negotiation anymore. You'll be killing yourself and your child at this rate." His voice softened. "Please, let me help." Julia looked into his eyes, seeing concern rather than pity. She thought of the child growing inside her, of the coming winter, of the impossible task before her. Slowly, reluctantly, she nodded. "Good," he said, relief evident in his voice. "We'll start at first light, you rest." "I can still help, you'll supervise," he cut her off gently. "Tell us how you want things done, it's your harvest." Without waiting for further argument, he helped her to her small cabin at the edge of the property. As they walked, Julia couldn't help but notice the strength in the arm that supported her, the faint scent of leather and sun-warmed skin. "Thank you," she said quietly as they reached her porch. Nathan Blackett nodded once, replaced his hat, and returned to his horse. "First light," he reminded her before riding off into the gathering dusk. Julia watched him go, one hand resting on her belly, unsure whether to feel grateful or uneasy about what tomorrow would bring. True to his word, Nathan arrived before dawn with 4 ranch hands and a wagon filled with equipment. Julia had been awake for hours, having slept fitfully, torn between relief and worry about accepting his help. She'd prepared a large pot of coffee and some cornbread, the least she could offer in return. "Mrs. Novak," Nathan greeted, hat in hand at her door. "Hope we're not disturbing you too early." "I've been up," she replied, gesturing to the coffee. "Please help yourselves before you start." The men filed in respectfully, each nodding to her as they entered. Nathan introduced them, brothers Elijah and Samuel Cooper, a weathered older man named Jacob Miller, and a young Mexican called Miguel Hernandez. They were polite but efficient, drinking their coffee standing and eating the cornbread with appreciative nods. "Got a good crew here," Nathan said. "The Cooper boys grew up on a wheat farm in Kansas before coming west. They know what they're doing." As the eastern sky began to lighten, the men moved into the fields with practiced coordination. Julia watched in amazement as they fell into a rhythm, cutting, binding, and stacking with an efficiency she could never have matched alone. By mid-morning, they had harvested more than she had managed in 3 days. Nathan worked alongside his men, his shirt darkening with sweat as the morning wore on. Occasionally, he would glance over to where Julia sat under the shade of an oak tree, as if checking that she was still resting. She had insisted on being present, unwilling to simply retreat to the cabin while others worked her land. At noon, Julia brought out a bucket of water and the lunch she had prepared, simple fare of beans, salt pork, and more cornbread. The men removed their hats and thanked her earnestly, sitting in the shade to eat. "Crop looks good," Elijah Cooper observed between mouthfuls. "Got a good yield here." "Thomas, my husband, he chose the land well," Julia said softly. Nathan, seated slightly apart from the others, looked over at her. "He had a good eye. This is prime farmland. He had plans to expand," Julia found herself saying. "Wanted to plant corn next season, maybe get some dairy cows." "Good thinking," Nathan nodded. "Diversifying is smart." After lunch, the men returned to work with renewed vigor. Julia insisted on helping with the binding, sitting in the shade while completing this task that required less physical exertion. Nathan had initially objected, but relented when he saw the determination in her eyes. "Stubborn woman," she overheard him mutter to Jacob, though there seemed to be a note of admiration in his voice. By sunset, they had harvested nearly a third of the field. The men loaded the last of the day's wheat onto the wagon and prepared to depart. "We'll be back tomorrow," Nathan said as his men mounted up. "Should make even better progress now that we've got a system going." Julia nodded, suddenly finding it difficult to speak. The enormity of what these men were doing for her, what he was doing for her, threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. "Mr. Blackett," she managed finally, "I don't know how to thank you." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "No need for thanks between neighbors," he said simply. then mounted his horse and led his men back toward his ranch. That night, alone in her cabin, Julia sat by the window watching the stars appear one by one. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt a small flame of hope kindle in her chest. Perhaps she and her child might survive here after all. The next 2 days followed a similar pattern. Nathan and his men arrived at dawn, worked tirelessly through the day, and departed at sunset. The field of wheat diminished steadily under their combined efforts, and Julia's spirits rose with each passing hour. On the 3rd day, as the last section of wheat was being cut, Julia noticed Nathan working slightly apart from the others. His movements were methodical but seemed more deliberate, as if he was taking extra care with each cut and bind. Curious, she made her way toward him, moving slowly to accommodate her pregnant body. "You handle a scythe well for a cattleman," she observed when she reached him. Nathan glanced up, a slight smile touching his lips. "Wasn't always a cattleman, grew up on a farm in Ohio. My father grew wheat, among other things." "You never mentioned that," he shrugged. "Never came up." Julia studied him, seeing him in a new light. "Why cattle, then, if you knew farming?" Nathan straightened, wiping sweat from his brow with a kerchief. "After the war, couldn't imagine staying in one place tied to the same patch of earth. Cattle seemed more mobile," he paused, "and profitable if done right." "The war changed many things," Julia said softly, thinking of Thomas, who had also fought, returning with nightmares that sometimes woke him screaming. Nathan nodded, a shadow passing over his face. "That it did." He looked out across the nearly harvested field. "Your husband had a good start here." "Solid foundation." "Yes, he did." Julia felt a familiar pang of grief, but it was accompanied now by something else, a sense of accomplishment in continuing what Thomas had begun. They worked side by side for a time, Julia gathering the cut wheat into bundles while Nathan wielded the scythe. The silence between them was comfortable, broken only by the rhythmic swish of the blade and the distant calls of the other men. "What will you do with the farm?" Nathan asked eventually. "After the baby comes," Julia hesitated. It was a question she had asked herself countless times in the lonely nights since Thomas's death. "Keep going, I suppose. It's all I have." "All we have," she corrected, one hand moving to her belly. Nathan nodded but said nothing more, returning to his work with focused intensity. Yet something in the air between them had shifted, a recognition of shared understanding that hadn't been there before. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Jacob called out from the far end of the field. "That's the last of it, boss." A cheer went up from the other men. Julia stood in stunned silence, gazing across what had been a seemingly insurmountable task just 3 days ago. The entire wheat crop was harvested, bundled, and stacked, ready to be threshed. "We did it," she whispered. "You did it," Nathan corrected, coming to stand beside her. "It's your farm, your harvest." Julia turned to him, unable to contain the smile that spread across her face. "We both know I couldn't have done this alone." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, something unspoken passing between them. Then Nathan cleared his throat and stepped back, replacing his hat. "Still need to thresh it all," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "But that can wait a day or two. Men need rest, and so do you." The men loaded their equipment onto the wagon and prepared to depart. Julia stood on her porch, watching them, trying to find words adequate to express her gratitude. "Mr. Blackett," she called as Nathan mounted his horse. He turned in his saddle to look at her. "Would you all of you come for supper tomorrow? It's little enough in return, but I'd like to thank you properly." Nathan seemed to hesitate before nodding. "That's kind of you, Mrs. Novak. We'd be honored." As they rode away in the gathering dusk, Julia remained on the porch, one hand resting on the swell of her child. The other pressed against her heart, which seemed to be beating in an unfamiliar rhythm. The next morning, Julia threw herself into preparations for the meal. She killed and plucked 2 of her chickens, gathered vegetables from her small garden, and used precious flour to bake both bread and a blackberry pie with berries she had preserved from summer. The work was exhausting in her condition, but it gave her purpose, something to focus on besides the confusing thoughts that had kept her awake much of the night. By late afternoon, delicious aromas filled the small cabin. Julia had time to wash and change into her best dress, one that still somewhat accommodated her growing belly, and arrange her hair. As she did so, she caught herself wondering what Nathan might think of her appearance, then immediately chided herself for such foolishness. He was a neighbor being kind, nothing more. The men arrived just before sunset, cleaned up from their day's work, hair slicked down with water. Nathan had even shaved, she noticed, the strong line of his jaw more prominent without the shadow of stubble. He carried a small wooden box under one arm. "Evening, Mrs. Novak," he said, removing his hat as the others followed suit. "Something smells mighty fine." Julia welcomed them in, suddenly self-conscious about the modest size of her cabin. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a small table that would be crowded with 6 people. A curtain at the back concealed her sleeping area. "It's not much," she apologized, "but please make yourselves comfortable." "It's a fine home, madam," Jacob said sincerely. "Reminds me of where I grew up." Miguel nodded in agreement. "Very nice, Senora Novak. Very warm." The men seated themselves around the table while Julia brought out the food. Nathan insisted on helping her, taking heavy platters from her hands despite her protests. Their fingers brushed during one such exchange, sending an unexpected warmth up Julia's arm. Once everything was laid out, roast chicken, potatoes, carrots, fresh bread, and preserves, the men looked to Julia expectantly. "Please," she gestured, "eat while it's hot." The meal proceeded with appreciative comments about the food interspersed with gentle conversation. The Cooper brothers told amusing stories about cattle drives, while Jacob, who had been everywhere from San Francisco to St. Louis, shared tales of his travels. Miguel spoke of his family in Sonora, and how he hoped to bring them north one day. Throughout the meal, Julia found her gaze drawn repeatedly to Nathan, who spoke less than the others but listened intently. Occasionally, their eyes would meet across the table, and she would quickly look away, unsure of the feeling stirring within her. After they had eaten their fill of pie, Nathan cleared his throat and placed the wooden box he had brought on the table. "Mrs. Novak, Julia, if I may," he began, uncharacteristically hesitant. My men and I wanted to give you something." He opened the box to reveal a beautiful silver locket on a delicate chain. Julia gasped softly. "It was my mother's," Nathan explained. "She always said it should go to someone who embodied the strength and grace she valued. The men and I agree, there's no one more deserving." Julia stared at the locket, then at the faces around her table, kind, sincere faces of men who had labored for days on her behalf without complaint or expectation. "I can't accept this," she whispered. "It's too much." "Please," Nathan said quietly. "It would honor her memory to see it worn by someone like you." The genuine emotion in his voice broke through Julia's resistance. With trembling fingers, she lifted the locket from its box. Nathan stood and moved behind her, taking it gently from her hands to fasten it around her neck. His fingers brushed against her skin, lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," she said, looking around at all of them but her gaze settling finally on Nathan. "For everything." The men departed soon after, leaving Nathan and Julia alone on the porch. The night was clear, stars scattered across the vast Nevada sky like diamond dust. "Will you be all right?" Nathan asked, his voice low. "With the threshing still to do, I'll manage," Julia said, though uncertainty crept into her voice. "I've imposed on you all enough." Nathan shook his head. "It's no imposition. We'll come back day after tomorrow to help with the threshing." "Mr. Blackett, Nathan," he corrected gently. "After sharing your table, I think we can use first names, don't you?" Julia nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "Nathan, then." He studied her face in the moonlight, his expression serious. "You're doing an incredible thing here, Julia, carrying on alone, expecting a child, running this farm. Most would have sold up and gone back east." "I have nowhere to go back to," she admitted. "And Thomas loved this land. It was his dream. I can't just abandon it." "His dream," Nathan repeated softly. "And yours?" The question caught her off guard. She had been so focused on survival, on honoring Thomas's memory, that she'd scarcely considered her own desires. "I suppose. To make a home," she said finally. "A safe place for my child to grow. That's dream enough for now." Nathan nodded, seeming to understand what she couldn't fully articulate. "Good night, Julia," he said, replacing his hat. "I'll see you soon." As he walked toward his waiting horse, Julia called after him, "Nathan." He turned. "Thank you for seeing me. Not just Thomas's widow or a woman in need, but me." Even in the dim light, she could see his smile. "That's the easiest thing I've done all week." True to his word, Nathan and his men returned 2 days later to help with the threshing. The work was hard and dusty, but they approached it with the same determined efficiency they had shown with the harvesting. Julia insisted on working alongside them despite Nathan's protests, operating the winnowing fan to separate wheat from chaff, while the men handled the more strenuous tasks. By the week's end, Julia's storeroom was filled with sacks of wheat, far more than she had dared hope to salvage when she had stood alone in her field days earlier. Some would be kept for planting in spring, some ground into flour for her own use, and the rest sold in town for much-needed cash to see her through winter. On the final day, as the last sacks were being stored, Nathan approached Julia with a proposition. "I've been thinking," he began, removing his hat and turning it in his hands. "That old barn of yours needs some repair before winter sets in. Roof's got weak spots and the north wall won't stand up to heavy snow." Julia sighed, having noticed the barn's deteriorating condition herself. "I know. I've been meaning to get to it, but I've got some extra lumber at my place," Nathan continued. "Was planning to build a new corral, but that can wait till spring. If you're agreeable, the men and I could fix up your barn next week." Julia studied him, perplexed by his continued generosity. "Why are you doing all this?" Nathan met her gaze steadily. "Because it's the right thing to do." "It's above and beyond neighborly kindness," she persisted. 5 men's labor for weeks, that's valuable time you could spend on your own ranch." A slight smile touched his lips. "Maybe I have my reasons." "Which are?" Instead of answering directly, Nathan glanced toward the cabin where Miguel was bringing out the last of their tools. "Come into town with me tomorrow," he said suddenly. "I need to pick up supplies, and you mentioned needing things for the baby. We could have lunch at the hotel." The unexpected invitation left Julia momentarily speechless. Is this?" She struggled to find the right words. "It's whatever you want it to be," Nathan said quietly. "Just lunch between neighbors, or," Julia prompted when he didn't continue. "Or a chance to get to know each other better," he finished, a hint of vulnerability in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. "Without scythes and threshers between us." Julia considered his offer, aware of the rapid beating of her heart. It had been only 3 months since Thomas's death. Was it too soon to even consider such a thing? Yet something about Nathan Blackett's steady presence, his quiet strength, called to her in a way she couldn't ignore. "Yes," she found herself saying. "I'd like that." The smile that spread across Nathan's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I'll come by around 10, he said, replacing his hat with newfound confidence. "Wear something nice. Not that you don't always look." He trailed off, a flush creeping up his neck. Julia couldn't help but smile at his sudden awkwardness. "I'll be ready at 10. The following morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect autumn day. Julia dressed with care in a blue gingham dress that had been altered to accommodate her pregnancy. She wore the silver locket Nathan had given her, its weight against her skin a constant reminder of his thoughtfulness. Nathan arrived precisely at 10, driving a smart buggy pulled by a matched pair of bays. He had traded his work clothes for a clean white shirt, dark vest, and polished boots. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. "You look beautiful," he said simply as he helped her into the buggy. Julia felt a blush warm her cheeks. "Thank you. You clean up well yourself." The drive to Awahi took about an hour, during which they talked with surprising ease. Nathan told her about growing up in Ohio, his 3 sisters who still lived there, and his journey west after the war. Julia shared stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania, her parents who had died of influenza when she was 18, and her marriage to Thomas 2 years later. "How did you meet him?" Nathan asked as they approached the outskirts of town. "At a church social," Julia replied. "He was passing through on his way west, stopped for a few days to rest his horse. Said he knew the moment he saw me that he'd found his reason to settle down." She smiled at the memory. "He was very persuasive." "He was a lucky man," Nathan said quietly. Julia looked at him, struck by the sincerity in his voice. "It wasn't always easy with Thomas. The war changed him, left scars that weren't visible. There were dark days when he could barely get out of bed, nights when he'd wake screaming." She paused. "But he tried. He loved this land, loved the idea of building something lasting." "And now you're carrying on that legacy," Nathan observed. "That takes courage." "Or foolishness," Julia said with a small laugh. "Some days I'm not sure which." Nathan guided the buggy down Awahi's main street, a dusty thoroughfare lined with wooden buildings, a general store, hotel, saloon, blacksmith, and various other businesses serving the needs of the surrounding ranches and mines. "I need to stop at the Mercantile first," Nathan said, pulling up in front of Wilcox's general store. "Then perhaps lunch at the hotel dining room," Julia nodded, allowing him to help her down from the buggy. Inside the store, Nathan greeted the proprietor with easy familiarity while Julia browsed the shelves. She selected yarn for knitting baby clothes, some fabric for swaddling blankets, and a few other necessities. When she approached the counter with her selections, Nathan was already paying for his own purchases. Nails, hinges, and other hardware she suspected were intended for her barn repairs. "Add the ladies' items as well," he instructed Mr. Wilcox. "Nathan, no," Julia protested. "I can pay for my own things." "Consider it an early gift for the little one," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Before Julia could respond, the store's door opened and Sheriff Daniels entered, his weathered face breaking into a smile when he saw her. "Mrs. Novak," he greeted, removing his hat. "Good to see you in town. How are you faring?" "Better than expected, Sheriff," Julia replied. "Thanks in part to Mr. Blackett here and his men. They've been helping with my harvest." The sheriff's eyebrows rose slightly as he glanced between them. "Is that so? Well, that's neighborly of you, Blackett," Nathan shrugged. "Just lending a hand where needed." Something in the sheriff's expression suggested he suspected there might be more to it, but he merely nodded. "Mrs. Novak, if you have a moment, I have some news regarding your husband's case." Julia's heart quickened. "Have you found who did it?" "Not exactly, but we have a lead. Could I speak with you privately?" Nathan stepped forward. Anything you need to say to Mrs. Novak can be said in front of me." The sheriff studied him for a moment before turning back to Julia. "Madam," Julia appreciated Nathan's protectiveness but nodded to the sheriff. "It's all right, Sheriff. Please, what news do you have?" "A man matching the description of one of the bandits was spotted in Elko last week," Sheriff Daniels explained. "He was flashing a gold pocket watch that sounds very much like the one your husband always carried." Julia's hand went to her throat, remembering the beautiful watch that had been a gift from Thomas's father. "Did you catch him?" "No, madam. By the time word reached me, he'd moved on, but I've sent descriptions to sheriffs all along the railroad line. If he tries to sell that watch, we'll hear of it." "Thank you for telling me," Julia said quietly. The sheriff replaced his hat. "We haven't forgotten Mrs. Novak. We'll find who did this." After he departed, Nathan placed a gentle hand on Julia's arm. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though her mind was suddenly filled with images of Thomas lying dead on that lonely trail. "It's just brings it all back." "We can postpone lunch if you'd prefer to return home," Nathan offered. Julia took a deep breath, pushing the dark thoughts away. No, I'd still like to have lunch." She managed a small smile. "Life goes on, doesn't it?" "It has to." Nathan's eyes softened with understanding. "Yes, it does." The hotel dining room was modestly elegant, with white tablecloths and actual glassware instead of tin cups. Several diners looked up as they entered, curious gazes lingering on Julia's pregnant form and the handsome man escorting her. She felt a moment of self-consciousness, knowing how quickly gossip spread in small communities. Nathan, however, seemed unconcerned with the attention, guiding Julia to a table by the window with a protective hand at the small of her back. He ordered for both of them roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread, then surprised her by asking the server if they had any pie. "Apple today, sir," the young woman replied. "Perfect. 2 slices for dessert, please." When they were alone, Julia raised an eyebrow. "Presumptuous to assume I want pie." A smile played at the corners of Nathan's mouth. "I've never met anyone who didn't want pie, especially apple." "Fair point," Julia conceded with a small laugh. As they ate, their conversation turned to plans for the coming winter and spring. Nathan spoke of expanding his herd, perhaps building a larger barn. Julia shared her hopes for planting corn alongside the wheat next season, maybe adding a kitchen garden with herbs and more vegetables. "You're planning to stay then?" Nathan asked, watching her carefully. "On the farm, I mean." Julia considered the question. "Yes," she said finally. "It's home now, for me and the baby." "It won't be easy," Nathan observed. "Even with a successful harvest, running a farm alone is hard work, especially with a young child." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Julia said, lifting her chin slightly. "I never thought you were," Nathan replied. "It's one of the things I admire most about you." The simple declaration, delivered without artifice, caught Julia off guard. She looked into his eyes and saw something there that made her heart flutter. Admiration, yes, but something more, something warmer. "Nathan," she began hesitantly, "I need to be clear about something. It's only been 3 months since Thomas died. I'm still—" She searched for the right words. "Grieving," Nathan supplied gently. "Of course you are, and carrying his child. I understand that, Julia." "Then what is this?" she asked, gesturing between them. "Why are you helping me, spending time with me?" Nathan was quiet for a moment, considering his response. "When I first saw you in that field, struggling alone with that harvest, something inside me shifted." He met her gaze steadily. "I admired your determination, your courage. And yes, I was drawn to you, your strength, your grace under pressure." He reached across the table, his fingers stopping just short of touching hers. "But I know timing matters. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give." Friendship for now is enough, the rest. He shrugged. The rest can wait if it's meant to be. Julia studied his face, moved by his honesty and patience. Slowly, deliberately, she moved her hand the remaining distance until her fingers rested lightly on his. Thank you for understanding. Their eyes held for a long moment, an unspoken connection forming between them that transcended words. The arrival of their pie broke the spell, but something had changed. A door had opened to possibilities Julia hadn't allowed herself to consider until now. The remainder of their time in town passed pleasantly, as they visited a few more shops. Nathan insisted on carrying all her packages, treating her with a gentle deference that made Julia feel both protected and respected, a stark contrast to the helplessness she had felt standing alone in her wheat field days earlier. As they drove home in the late afternoon sun, Julia found herself relaxing into a comfortable silence beside Nathan. The landscape rolled past, golden in the autumn light, beautiful despite its harshness. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt a sense of peace about her decision to stay, to build a life here for herself and her child. The peace was shattered abruptly when they turned onto the road leading to Julia's farm. Nathan tensed beside her, his hands tightening on the reins. "What is it?" Julia asked, alarmed by his sudden change in demeanor. "Smoke," he said grimly, pointing ahead where a dark plume rose against the sky, "coming from the direction of your place." Fear clutched at Julia's heart as Nathan urged the horses to a faster pace. As they drew closer, her worst fears were confirmed. Her barn was ablaze, flames licking at the wooden structure, black smoke billowing upward. Nathan pulled the buggy to a halt at a safe distance. "Stay here," he commanded, jumping down. "My animals," Julia cried, making to follow him. "Stay in the buggy," Nathan repeated firmly. "Think of your baby. I'll check on the animals." Julia watched anxiously as Nathan ran toward the burning barn. The heat was intense even from where she sat, the crackle and roar of the fire drowning out all other sounds. She scanned the area for any sign of what might have caused the blaze. When movement near the edge of her property caught her eye, 3 riders were galloping away, heading toward the foothills. They were too distant to make out clearly, but something about their hasty departure sent a chill down Julia's spine. This was no accident. Nathan emerged from the barn leading her 2 draft horses and single milk cow. The animals were frightened but unharmed. He secured them to a fence post before running back to check the cabin, which thankfully showed no signs of fire. By the time he returned to the buggy, Julia was shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. "I saw them," she said as he approached. 3 riders heading west. They did this, Nathan." His expression darkened. "You're sure?" They were running away, watching the fire. This was deliberate. Nathan's jaw tightened as he looked from the burning barn to the distant riders, now merely specks on the horizon. "Do you have any idea who would do this? Any enemies?" Julia shook her head, then suddenly remembered the sheriff's words from earlier that day. "The bandits who killed Thomas. What if they've come back? Why would they target your barn now? I don't know. Warning. Revenge because the sheriff is still looking for them." Julia's hand moved protectively to her belly. "Nathan, what if they come back?" The determination in his eyes was steely. "They won't get near you, I promise you that. The barn couldn't be saved." They watched in somber silence as the structure collapsed in on itself, the fire eventually burning down to smoldering embers. Nathan insisted Julia stay in the buggy while he checked the rest of the property for any other damage or signs of the intruders. "Nothing else seems touched," he reported when he returned, "and no sign of anyone lingering." "What am I going to do?" Julia whispered, staring at the charred remains of the barn. "Winter's coming. The animals need shelter. The wheat." "The wheat's safe in your storeroom," Nathan reminded her. "And we can rebuild the barn. Better than before. My men and I. With the lumber I already have, we can have a basic structure up in a week." He took her hand. "But first, you're coming to my place. You can't stay here alone tonight." Julia started to protest, but stopped when she saw the resolve in his face. He was right, she wasn't safe here, not until they knew who had set the fire and why. "All right," she agreed quietly. "Just for tonight." Nathan helped her gather some essential belongings from the cabin, then loaded her animals into a makeshift rope corral behind the buggy. As the sun began to set, they left the smoldering remains of the barn behind, heading toward the safety of Nathan's ranch. Nathan's home was larger than Julia had expected, a well-built two-story house with a wide porch and glass windows, uncommon luxuries on the frontier. A large barn and several outbuildings completed the ranch complex, all showing signs of careful maintenance. "It's beautiful," Julia said as they approached. "Been working on it for a year," Nathan replied with evident pride. "Still more to do, but it's coming along." His ranch hands emerged from the bunkhouse as they arrived, expressions turning to concern when Nathan explained what had happened. Jacob immediately took charge of Julia's animals, leading them toward the barn, while the Cooper brothers began unloading her belongings. "Miguel," Nathan called to the young Mexican who had approached the buggy, "ride into town and inform Sheriff Daniels about what happened. Tell him we saw 3 riders heading west into the foothills. Senor Blackett, right away." As Miguel rode off, Nathan helped Julia down from the buggy, his hand lingering supportively at her elbow. "Let's get you inside. You must be exhausted." The interior of the house was as impressive as the exterior, simple but well-crafted furniture, polished wooden floors, a massive stone fireplace. It was clearly a bachelor's home, functional rather than decorative, but clean and welcoming. "It's not much for entertaining," Nathan said apologetically, leading her into the main room. "But you'll be comfortable. I've got a spare bedroom upstairs that Mrs. Cooper, Elijah, and Samuel's mother uses when she visits. It's all made up." "This is very kind of you," Julia said, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the day and his continued generosity. Nathan noticed her distress. "Sit down before you fall down," he urged gently, guiding her to a chair by the fireplace. "I'll make some tea." While he busied himself in the kitchen, Julia took in her surroundings more carefully. Despite its utilitarian nature, the house revealed glimpses of its owner's character: books on a shelf near the window, a fine saddle on a rack in the corner, a small framed photograph on the mantel. She rose to examine this last item more closely. The photograph showed a family: a stern-looking man in his 50s, a gentle-faced woman beside him, and 4 children, including a young man Julia recognized as Nathan despite his youth and the Union Army uniform he wore. "My family," Nathan said from behind her, "taken before I left for the war." Julia turned to find him holding 2 steaming cups. "You look so young," she observed, accepting one of the cups. "Was young. 18 when I enlisted, 22 when I came home." His expression grew distant. "Felt a lot older, though." Julia understood. Thomas had been the same way, aged beyond his years by what he had seen and done during the conflict. "Your sisters?" she asked, gesturing to the 3 young women in the photograph, still in Ohio, all married now with children of their own. A small smile touched his lips. "Mother writes regularly, always including not-so-subtle hints about my bachelor status and how I'm not getting any younger. And your father," the smile faded, "passed 3 years ago. Heart gave out while plowing the back 40. "I'm sorry," Julia said softly. Nathan nodded his acknowledgement. "He was a good man, strict but fair, taught me everything I know about farming, about being a man of my word." He'd be proud of you, Julia said, looking around at what Nathan had built. All this from nothing. Hope so, Nathan replied, a vulnerability in his voice that touched Julia deeply. They sat by the fire, drinking tea and talking quietly until a knock at the door announced Miguel's return from town. The young man reported that the sheriff had been informed of the fire and would ride out first thing in the morning to investigate. He also said to tell Senora Novak not to worry, that he has men searching for the bandits, Miguel added. Julia thanked him, though she doubted the sheriff's men would find anything in the vast Nevada wilderness. Whoever had set the fire was likely miles away by now. As evening deepened into night, Nathan showed Julia to the upstairs bedroom, a pleasant space with a comfortable-looking bed, rag rug on the floor, and curtained window overlooking the ranch yard. "If you need anything, I'm just down the hall," Nathan said, lingering in the doorway. "Try to rest." "You've had quite a day." Julia nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. "Thank you, Nathan, for everything." He studied her for a moment, concern evident in his eyes. "You're safe here, Julia, I promise you that." After he left, Julia changed into her nightgown and sat on the edge of the bed, her hand resting on her swollen belly where the baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her distress. "It's all right," she whispered. "We're safe." But as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that today's fire was just the beginning of her troubles. Someone had deliberately targeted her farm, whether the same men who killed Thomas or others with unknown grudges. She couldn't be sure. But one thing was certain. They knew where she lived, and they had shown they were willing to do harm. Her thoughts turned to Nathan, to the quiet strength he had shown today and every day since he first offered to help with her harvest. In just a week, he had become a foundation she hadn't known she needed, steady and reliable in a world that suddenly seemed full of threats. It was dangerous, this growing dependence on him. Dangerous and yet, somehow, inevitable. Like a seedling turning toward the sun, she found herself drawn to his warmth, his protection, his unwavering support. "Be careful, Julia," she whispered to herself in the darkness. "Guard your heart." But even as she cautioned herself, she knew it might already be too late. Sheriff Daniels arrived early the next morning, his face grim as he examined the charred remains of Julia's barn. Nathan stood beside him, pointing out the tracks they had found 3 horses, heading west as Julia had described. "Definitely deliberate," the sheriff concluded, crouching to examine a spot where an empty whiskey bottle lay shattered among the ashes. "They used this to accelerate the fire." "Cowards," Nathan muttered, his hand resting instinctively on the revolver at his hip. The sheriff straightened, dusting ash from his hands. "Mrs. Novak mentioned seeing riders. Any chance you got a look at them, Blackett?" "Too distant," Nathan admitted. "But Julia's right, it could be connected to her husband's murder." "The timing's too suspicious, coming right after you mentioned that lead about the pocket watch." Sheriff Daniels nodded thoughtfully. "Could be. Could also be local troublemakers. We've had problems with a gang operating out of the foothills, rustling cattle, robbing stage coaches. They might see a woman alone as an easy target." "Either way, she's not safe here," Nathan said firmly. "Not until they're caught." "Agreed. What's your plan?" Nathan hesitated, aware that what he was about to propose might seem presumptuous. "I've offered her a place at my ranch until we can rebuild the barn. My men and I will stay here during the day to work, but she'll be safer at my place at night." The sheriff raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Practical solution, though folks will talk." "Let them," Nathan replied, unconcerned. "Her safety is what matters. And after the barn is rebuilt," Nathan met the older man's gaze steadily. "One step at a time, Sheriff." Sheriff Daniels studied him for a long moment before clapping him on the shoulder. You're a good man, Blackett. Mrs. Novak is fortunate to have such a neighbor. He glanced toward the cabin where Julia was gathering more of her belongings. I'll have deputies patrol this area more frequently. Keep an eye out for those riders, and I'll let you know if we learn anything more about that pocket watch. After the sheriff departed, Nathan found Julia in her bedroom, carefully folding clothes into a small trunk. She looked up as he entered, her face pale but composed. "The sheriff thinks it was deliberate," she said, more statement than question. Nathan nodded. "Found evidence they used whiskey to start it." Julia's hand stilled on the dress she was folding. "Why? What have I done to deserve this?" "Nothing," Nathan said firmly, stepping closer. "This isn't about anything you've done. These are bad men, Julia. Whether they're connected to Thomas's death or just opportunists targeting what they thought was a vulnerable homestead, they're cowards who deserve to be brought to justice." "And until then," she asked quietly, "until then you stay with me. We rebuild your barn stronger than before. And we remain vigilant." Julia looked around the small bedroom that had been hers and Thomas's, at the simple furnishings they had brought west with such hope. "It's not just the barn, Nathan. It's the feeling that nowhere is safe anymore. That everything Thomas and I built could be taken away in an instant." Nathan moved closer, tentatively placing his hands on her shoulders. "I understand that fear, but you're not alone in this, Julia. Not anymore." She looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation or doubt. Finding none, she allowed herself to lean slightly into his strength. "I'm beginning to believe that," she admitted softly. For a brief moment, they stood together in the quiet of the room, the connection between them deepening in shared understanding. Then Julia straightened, resuming her packing with renewed determination. "Let's not give them the satisfaction of driving me away for good. This is still my home, and I intend to fight for it." The admiration in Nathan's eyes was unmistakable. "I wouldn't expect anything less." The next week passed in a blur of activity. True to his word, Nathan and his men began rebuilding Julia's barn, using the salvageable lumber from the old structure, and supplementing it with the materials Nathan had originally purchased for his own projects. Julia divided her time between helping where she could at her farm during the day and returning to the safety of Nathan's ranch each evening. The arrangement quickly settled into a comfortable routine. During the day, they worked side by side, Julia preparing meals for the men and assisting with lighter tasks despite Nathan's continued protests about her condition. In the evenings at his ranch, they would sit by the fire after supper, talking about their childhoods, their hopes, their views on everything from politics to literature. Nathan, Julia discovered, was well-read despite his frontier lifestyle, with a particular fondness for Shakespeare and Mark Twain. She found herself looking forward to these quiet conversations, to the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, to the deep timbre of his voice as he read aloud from one of his books. By the end of the week, the new barn was taking shape larger and sturdier than the original, with better ventilation for the animals and improved storage for hay and equipment. Nathan had incorporated several innovative features, explaining each one to Julia with evident pride. "The roof is pitched more steeply," he pointed out as they stood examining the day's progress. "Better for shedding snow in winter, and see these reinforced corners, makes the whole structure stronger against wind." "It's wonderful, Nathan," Julia said sincerely. "Far better than what we had before. We can have it finished in another few days," he promised. "Then you can bring your animals back. And return to my cabin," Julia added, watching his expression carefully. A shadow crossed Nathan's face before he masked it. "Of course." "If that's what you want, isn't it what's proper?" she asked softly. Nathan turned to face her fully. Proper, he repeated, a hint of frustration in his voice. Julia, we're in Nevada territory, not Philadelphia. Out here, what's proper is what keeps you safe and allows you to survive. And you think I can't survive on my own? I know you can, he corrected firmly. You've proven that a dozen times over, but it doesn't mean you should have to. He ran a hand through his hair, searching for the right words. The barn will be rebuilt, yes, but what about the people who burned it? They're still out there, and when your baby comes, you'll be even more vulnerable. What are you suggesting, Nathan? Julia asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. He hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Taking her hand, he led her to a nearby tree stump and gestured for her to sit. He remained standing, suddenly seeming nervous in a way she hadn't seen before. I had a plan, he began. Was going to wait until the barn was finished. Do this properly. He shook his head ruefully. But maybe there's no proper way to say what needs saying. Julia's heart quickened as Nathan knelt before her, still holding her hand. Julia Novak, in the short time I've known you, you've shown me more courage, more determination, more grace than I've seen in a lifetime. I admire you. I respect you. He paused, his blue eyes holding hers intently. And I've grown to care for you deeply. Nathan, she breathed, hardly daring to believe where this was leading. I know it's soon, he continued. I know you're still grieving Thomas, still carrying his child, and I would never try to replace him in your heart or your memories. His grip on her hand tightened slightly. But I'm asking if you might consider making a new start with me, as my wife. The words hung in the air between them, momentous and transformative. Julia stared at him, her mind racing with conflicting emotions: surprise, fear, hope, guilt. This isn't just about protecting me, is it? She asked quietly. Nathan shook his head. Protection is part of it, yes, I won't deny that, but it's so much more, Julia. It's about building something together, a partnership, a family. He glanced at her swollen belly. I would raise your child as my own, love them as my own, and perhaps in time, we might have more, Julia finished for him, the image of a future she hadn't dared imagine suddenly vivid in her mind. Yes, he searched her face anxiously. I know this is sudden. I don't expect an answer now. Take time to think. Yes, Julia interrupted, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Nathan blinked. Yes. A smile spread across Julia's face, tentative at first, then blooming with growing confidence. Yes, Nathan Blackett, I will marry you. The joy that transformed his features was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. In one fluid motion, he rose and pulled her gently to her feet, his hands cradling her face as if she were made of porcelain. May I? He whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips. In answer, Julia leaned forward, closing the distance between them. His kiss was gentle, reverent, a promise rather than a demand. She felt something within her shift and settle, like a key turning in a lock long rusted shut. When they parted, Nathan rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her skin. I will do everything in my power to make you happy, Julia, to keep you and your child safe. Our child, she corrected softly. If I'm to be your wife, then this baby will be yours in all the ways that matter. The emotion that crossed Nathan's face was too complex to name: gratitude, humility, fierce protectiveness, and something deeper, something that made Julia's heart swell with answering warmth. When? He asked. The wedding, I mean. Soon, Julia decided. Before the baby comes, but after the barn is finished, she added with a small smile. One project at a time, Mr. Blackett. His laugh was rich with happiness. As you wish, Mrs. Soon-to-be Blackett. The news of their engagement spread quickly through the small community around Awahi. Some expressed surprise at the hastiness of the arrangement, given Julia's recent widowhood and advanced pregnancy. But many more, particularly those who had witnessed Nathan's tireless efforts to help Julia with her harvest and rebuild her barn, nodded in understanding and approval. Sheriff Daniels was among the first to congratulate them when they went to town to speak with the minister about performing the ceremony. "Can't say I'm surprised," the sheriff admitted, shaking Nathan's hand vigorously. "Saw the way you looked at her that day in the mercantile. Figured it was just a matter of time." "Was I that obvious?" Nathan asked, slightly chagrined. "To everyone but Mrs. Novak, apparently," the sheriff replied with a chuckle. The minister, a kindly older man named Reverend Wilson, agreed to perform the ceremony the following Saturday at Nathan's ranch. "A simple service," he suggested, "with just a few friends as witnesses, more appropriate given the circumstances." Julia appreciated his tact. A lavish celebration would have seemed disrespectful to Thomas's memory, yet she found herself genuinely looking forward to beginning this new chapter of her life with Nathan. The days leading up to the wedding were filled with final work on the barn and preparations for Julia's permanent move to Nathan's ranch. They decided her cabin would be maintained for use by ranch hands during planting and harvest seasons, ensuring her land remained productive. On the morning of the wedding, Julia stood in the upstairs bedroom of Nathan's soon-to-be their home, smoothing the fabric of the simple cream-colored dress she had altered for the occasion. Her pregnancy was prominently visible now at 7 months, but she felt no shame in it, only a quiet joy that this child would be born into a home with both a mother and father to love them. A knock at the door announced Mrs. Cooper, who had arrived early to help Julia prepare. "You look beautiful, dear," the older woman said warmly, adjusting the small wreath of autumn flowers that crowned Julia's dark hair. "Nathan is a fortunate man." "I'm the fortunate one," Julia replied sincerely. "He's given me hope when I thought all was lost." Mrs. Cooper patted her hand. "You've given him something equally precious: purpose. Before you came along, he was just building a ranch. Now he's building a life." The simple ceremony took place on the front porch of the ranch house as the afternoon sun bathed everything in golden light. Julia would forever remember the look on Nathan's face as she walked toward him on Sheriff Daniels' arm, a mixture of awe, tenderness, and fierce joy that made her heart swell with answering emotion. They spoke their vows clearly, their hands joined, their eyes never leaving each other's faces. When Reverend Wilson pronounced them husband and wife, Nathan's kiss was both gentle and possessive, a perfect balance that seemed to define the man himself. The small gathering of friends, the Coopers, Jacob, Miguel, Sheriff Daniels and his wife, a few neighboring ranchers celebrated with a feast prepared by Mrs. Cooper and the sheriff's wife. There was music from Jacob's fiddle, dancing despite Julia's condition, and an atmosphere of genuine goodwill that warmed her more than the autumn sunshine. As dusk fell, the guests departed, leaving the newlyweds alone. Nathan led Julia to the porch swing where they sat together, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him as they watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "Happy?" he asked softly, his fingers gently stroking her arm. "Very," Julia replied, surprised at how true it was. The grief for Thomas hadn't disappeared. She suspected it never would entirely, but it had transformed into something that could coexist with this new happiness, this second chance she had never expected. "I was thinking," Nathan said after a comfortable silence, "about names for the baby." Julia looked up at him, touched that he was already embracing his role as the child's father. "Did you have something in mind?" He nodded, a slight hesitation in his eyes. "If it's a boy, what would you think of Thomas? As a middle name," he added quickly, "to honor his memory." Tears sprang to Julia's eyes at the unexpected suggestion. "You would do that?" he was your husband, Julia. He'll always be part of your story, part of this child's heritage. I don't want to erase that." Julia reached up to touch his face, marveling at the generosity of spirit that defined this man she had married. "Thank you. Yes, I'd like that very much. And for a first name," he prompted. Julia considered for a moment. "William, after your father." The smile that spread across Nathan's face was answer enough. "William Thomas Blackett," he said softly, placing his hand on her belly where the baby kicked as if in approval. "Strong name for a strong boy." "And if it's a girl?" Julia asked. "Something beautiful," Nathan replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "Like her mother." 2 months later, as the first heavy snows of winter blanketed the Nevada landscape, Julia went into labor. Nathan, who had barely left her side in the preceding weeks, sent Miguel galloping through the snow to fetch the midwife from town while Jacob heated water, and Mrs. Cooper, who had been staying with them in anticipation of this moment, prepared the bedroom. The labor was long and difficult. Outside, the wind howled around the sturdy ranch house, snow piling against the windows, but inside, the only sounds were Julia's pained cries and the midwife's steady instructions. Nathan, refusing to be banished as was customary, remained by his wife's side, holding her hand, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement as she fought to bring their child into the world. As dawn broke on a crystal-clear winter morning, a new cry joined the sounds of the household, strong, indignant, unmistakably alive. "A boy," the midwife announced triumphantly, lifting the squirming, red-faced infant for his parents to see. "A fine, healthy boy." Nathan's face, haggard from the night's vigil, transformed with wonder as the midwife placed the swaddled infant in Julia's arms. "William," he whispered, gently touching the baby's cheek with one calloused finger. "William Thomas Blackett," Julia confirmed, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten as she gazed at her son, their son. She looked up at Nathan, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain. "Your son." The emotion that crossed his face was raw and unguarded. "Our son," he corrected gently, his voice thick with feeling as he bent to kiss first the baby's forehead, then Julia's lips. "Our miracle." In the months that followed, as winter gave way to spring, Julia watched with growing contentment as Nathan embraced fatherhood with the same quiet determination he brought to everything. He would walk the floor with William at night, singing softly in a surprisingly pleasant baritone. During the day, he often carried the baby in a sling across his chest as he went about his ranch work, pointing out cattle and horses to the wide-eyed infant as if he could understand every word. One evening in early May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, William sleeping peacefully in Julia's arms, Nathan broached a subject that had been on his mind. "I've been thinking about expanding," he said, his arm comfortable around her shoulders. "The ranch?" Julia asked. "Yes, but not just that." He gestured toward her farm, visible in the distance. "I was thinking we might connect our properties officially, register them as one ranch, the Double B maybe." "The Double B," Julia repeated, considering the idea. "For Blackett." Nathan nodded. "Your wheat fields, my cattle. Diversification like we talked about. And when William's older, there'll be plenty for him to inherit to build on." "I'd like that," Julia said, imagining the legacy they were creating for their son and perhaps, someday, for other children. "A true partnership." "That's what we are," Nathan agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Partners in all things." As the sky deepened to purple and the first stars appeared, Julia Blackett, no longer alone, no longer afraid, looked out over the land that had once seemed so threatening in its vastness. Now, with Nathan beside her and William in her arms, that same land represented possibility, prosperity, a future rich with promise. From that first moment in the wheat field, when an unexpected neighbor had offered his help with no thought of reward, to this quiet evening on the porch of their shared home, Julia's journey had been one of loss and recovery, of endings and beginnings, of a harvest that yielded far more than wheat. "I never expected this," she said softly, more to herself than to Nathan. "After Thomas died, I thought my life was over. I was just trying to survive." Nathan's arm tightened around her, and now Julia turned to him, her eyes reflecting the emerging stars. "Now I'm living, truly living." As if in agreement, William stirred in her arms, his tiny hand reaching up to touch his mother's face. Nathan leaned down to kiss his son's forehead, then his wife's lips, a simple gesture that conveyed all the love and commitment words could not express. Above them, the stars of the Nevada sky bore witness to a miracle as old as time, yet always knew a family forged not by blood alone, but by choice, by courage, by love that had found its way through grief to hope, through darkness to dawn, through the vast wilderness to home.